Hey guys, and welcome to paragraphs 7 to 8. This time we're going to explore what Descartes would mean by universals, mathematics, and the a priori. I think the best thing we could say is most of this refers to objects of necessity, which we covered in year 11 when looking at necessary versus contingent objects, or contingent beings versus necessary beings. So we should be quite familiar with a lot of this stuff, and it will set us up to understand a bit of Descartes' theory later on. Okay, so we need to name and define the key terms that have been mentioned here. Then we need to explore how Descartes may have assumed that all of these key terms apply to different possible worlds. And when I say possible worlds, what I'm really doing is talking about that idea of necessity, or necessity of being according to different possible worlds. Remember, I can have a triangle in this world and a triangle in an imaginary world. That imaginary world might not exist, but the logic of what a triangle is cannot be flawed or cannot be any different in the possible world that I can imagine. So obviously the triangle is necessarily an object with 3 straight sides and 3 angles. All those angles inside add up to 180 degrees, and that's in the imaginary world and the outside world. All right, so write down these 2 success criteria for me, pretty please, with the cherry on top. And then I want you to look at these 2 necessary concepts. They're both geometrical. So in other words, they're kind of an idea of mathematical relationships applied to space, or really as space relationships. And as you can see, we've got parallel lines, and we've got a circle here with a diameter and a radius. Now, what we need to ask ourselves is, can you really imagine a squared circle or a series of parallel lines that do eventually meet? Think about that, write your answer down in your book, and once you've scored yourself and written that answer, we can move on. Thank you. Alright, so now it's time for the summary. So even if we are dreaming, we know that parts of that dream, not necessarily the dream itself, but components of the dream could be real or based in reality. So the last thing that we read was basically an evaluation of the components, the colors, the shapes, the objects, all the things in the dream had to be based on some kind of composite or reflection of things that really were real. In other words, the fictitious being that could be in our dreams may be a rearrangement of different things, but ultimately things like colors and shapes and form, they have to be based on something that's real in order for the dream to make sense. So that's a good place to start, okay? Now remember that a dream is like a picture. Write that down. And dreams are made up of, according to our man, colors, shapes, numbers. Quantity would be a better word than numbers. Dreams have colors, dreams have shapes, dreams have quantity of objects within them, right? And we know that these are things that exist in our dreamlike state, but they also are things that tend to exist when we're awake. In other words, we perceive them when asleep and we perceive them when awake. So perhaps these things, which we could argue are some kind of a priori, or these things hint at an a priori, are the foundations for some kind of first principle, some kind of first truth, right? So what he argues is, from a reflection about what dreams and the waking state have in common, maybe we can find that foundation stone. Take a note. So he doesn't necessarily say that shapes, another more academic word for that would be form, color, or what's the word I'm looking for, or quantity, are the a prioris that are underpinning both possible versions of reality. But what he does say is that maybe something behind it might be underpinning what is real. So there must be some kind of a priori built into our imaginary existence in the dream and some kind of real existence in the waking world. And these are the a prioris. Remember, they're the rational first principles which everything else is based upon, okay? Remember, if it's a posteriori, that's an empirical kind of first principle, but an a priori is like a rational, logically deduced idea that everything is based on. So he's saying, look at dreams, look at dreams, look at waking world, and maybe we can find these rational things that everything's based on. And we're going to call these universals because they exist in all possible worlds. Take a note. And it doesn't take a genius to realize that because he's a rationalist and he believes in a priori truths, not an empiricist who believes in a posteriori truths, he would be saying that underpinning all these things that we tend to see across dreams and across the waking world are usually based on the laws of physics, or even the laws of physics are based on logic. So that logic is reflected in mathematics and geometry. We see geometry, which gives things shape and form and gives things quantity. So basically, it's not just mathematics, but logic, mathematics, and geometry are possibly the a prioris that underpin the common things that we see, or the composite things that we see in the waking world and the dreaming world. Take a note. All right, so let's do a quick reading of these two paragraphs because they're quite easy to do. So just remember, he's talked about dreams, dreams being made up of composite things, dreams being like a picture that are made up of the same kind of composite stuff, such as colors or shapes or quantity. And now we're going into a discussion about what we can conclude from that. And remember, the methodological doubt is basically seeing how we can find that one thing that is certain. So it's not about something being false, it's about something that can be doubted. And if it can be doubted, we throw it away until we find the certain thing. And remember also, he's going for a series of core assumptions or core beliefs, and he's trying to see whether or not they can be doubted, because then everything on top will fall down if they can be doubted. And eventually he'll get to that one thing, which a whole bunch of other philosophical truths and philosophical systems can be based on. So let's have a look. This class appears to include corporal, so that's body, nature in general. So what he's saying is there's a class of things that tend to exist in dreams and in the waking state. And he's saying this class appears to be like a body like in nature, or have physical form really. So this class appears to include corporal nature in general and is extension. And its extension. So basically all the other things. The shape of extended things, the quantity or size and number of these things, the place in which they may exist, and the time through which they may endure, and so on. So he's saying these are probably the a priori truths that we find in both realities. Or maybe they're the things that we know. They're not actually the a priori truths. They're the class of things that are common amongst dreams and the waking world. So let's go through them and list them down, okay? So he's saying the body and its extension through space. Write that down. The shape of extended things, the quantity or size and number of these things, the place in which they may exist, the time through which they may endure, and so on. So can you write those down? And then, of course, he goes on to say, well, they're the class of things. They're not the a priori, because there are probably some a priori truths that underpin all these things that I've just listed. So let's have a look. So a reasonable conclusion from this might be that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all other disciplines which depend on the study of composite things are doubtful, while arithmetic and geometry and other subjects of this kind, which deal only with the simplest and most general things, regardless of whether they really exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable. For whether I am awake or asleep, 2 and 3 added together are 5, and a square has no more than 4 sides. It seems impossible that such transparent truth should incur any suspicion of being false. So here he basically says, if you look at shape, time, space, you could all understand how objects behave using physics, but maybe physics is just too broad. It's such a broad philosophical system. What's really going on is you need arithmetic and geometry and other simpler subjects to understand physics, which then helps you understand these class of objects. So the a priori truths probably revolve around arithmetic, geometry, and other subjects of this kind, like logic. So take a note, and you can see he's just saying these a prioris underpin the class that appears between dreams and the waking world, and maybe they're undoubtable. Take some notes. So we have defined key terms. We understand that universals are these things that appear in both the dreaming and waking world. We understand that mathematics is one of the a prioris, or the a priori truths that underpin more broad things that exist between the two different worlds. So shape, size, quantity, form, time, all those things can be understood using mathematics and geometry. And we understand that there are a prioris, or simple kind of areas of study that assert certain truths outside of space and time that can be used to underpin it. So therefore, we now understand too that, when we look at these key terms and how they apply across different worlds, we're talking really about a priori kind of simple truths like logic, maths, and geometry, which then underpin greater disciplines, which then can be used to understand how, phenomena and things occur across the two different possible worlds of the dreaming and waking world. All right, that should be it for now. Thank you very much for listening.